My name is Clara Stella. From March 2022, I work as a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Integrated Philologies at the University of Seville with the Maria Zambrano Fellowship. And I belong to the research group Escritoras y Escrituras. My research focuses on early modern Italian women poets and writers. That means writers from the 15th until the 17th centuries. I also work on the querelle des femmes, the famous debate about the nobility of women that shaped intellectually the relationships between men and women at that time, for which I collaborate with the subgroup called Men for Women. I graduated from Padua, and my passion for women writers began and developed when I started my PhD thesis in Leeds in the UK. There, I closely worked with experts in the field of the history of the book, the history of the printing press, and lyric theory. My thesis has shed light on 53 women authors collected in one of the most important texts in the canon of women's writings, that is basically Lodovico Domenichi's Rime diverse da alcune nobilissime virtuosissime donne, which sounds in English like various poems by some most noble and most virtuous women. Published in 1559, is the first omnibus collection of women's poetry in all of Europe. I then went to Oslo. After the UK, I went to Oslo in Norway as a Marie Curie Fellow at the Department of History of Ideas with the European-funded project Women Writing Saints, Proto-feminist discourses in religious texts written by women in Counter-Reformation Italy. A project in collaboration with another one funded by the Norwegian Research Council named The Legacy of Birgitta of Sweden, Women, Politics and Reform in Renaissance Italy, that tried to answer the following fundamental question: what are women's contributions to European textile cultures and knowledge production, and how Renaissance and early modern female writers may have fashioned their authorial voice on a medieval Swedish saint called Birgitta of Sweden. Yes, so that's basically my background in my research. Well, basically, I would say the relationship between women and public power, leadership, and their underrepresentation or stereotypical representation. For example, you can just think about how the press for years has described, I don't know, Angela Merkel by adopting the concept of the virago from the Italian Renaissance. That is a concept that has a very long history and a misogynistic one. So their underrepresentation and anonymity within the canon, the historical and intellectual canon, basically. So women have always been represented as exceptional in those fields. But that is because women have simply been excluded from public representation, and patriarchal culture made sure to erase their presence and memory from our collective memory. So, for example, women were allowed in medieval times, women were allowed to speak as prophets. They could conquer political space and power, but who would link, for example, religion and the sacred space with a tradition of political thinkers that includes women as well as men? Nobody, basically. That's why humanities can challenge the misogynistic assumptions that have been shaping society until nowadays, when one takes a gender and feminist perspective into account in her or his research. I would just start with my monograph that has been recently published. So my monograph on Lodovico Domenichi's Rime di donne. And is a monograph that looks at the anthology as a useful source for our better understanding of Italian women poets. And culturally, it reveals the level of the education of those noble women, their literary skills, and how these 53 women possessed an ability to adopt and adapt to the lyrical models that they had inherited. And moving into the other project, so the project Women Writing Saints moved between different fields, the field of literature, history of ideas, and looked at sainthood basically from a political perspective, which is not, you know, the one we are used to. So in particular, I asked myself how women authors have negotiated the legacy of female saints in their writings as both subjects as well as intellectual and ethical inspirations for their own and authorship and political thinking. Basically, if we think that the age of the print started in the 16th century with the print of the letters of Catherine of Siena, this is super important. So we have a woman at the start of the presented as a model of author and ethical voice at the start of a key center for European history and literature. Well, that is a very good question. I think in society, I would like to disseminate the results more widely and extensively, collaborating, for example, with editorial presses for students and manuals of literature for high school students. I think that representation is and visibility is the key answer to tackle the still existing gender gap. It seems very obvious, but if one sees herself represented in textbooks, for example, likely to take a much more ambitious career and self-confidence. In my childhood, I clearly remember how my sex was absolutely underrepresented in textbooks as well as in public spaces. I also would like to tackle gender gap from an historical perspective, studying the historical roots of the development of hate speech against women, how hate speech, so misogyny, have different and differently articulation and manifestations, how hate speech continues to permeate society and culture today as yesterday, in repetitive but increasingly refined forms and patterns. Also, I'd like to add that aside from research, I co-founded a feminist publishing house 2 years ago called the Plurali Editrice, that is a feminist, independent, inclusive publishing house that publishes non-fiction and fiction books written exclusively by female authors.